Some wounds never heal, no matter how many years pass by. For Jedediah Cole, losing his boy in the war meant learning to live with a hole in his heart that time couldn't touch. This old mountain man had made peace with his loneliness in the Montana wilderness, spending his days with nothing but memories and regrets. Then one evening, a bleeding dog showed up at his camp, limping and desperate, with eyes that seemed to be asking for help. Something about that dog made Jed follow it through the forest to an old watchtower from the war. Inside the crumbling walls, he found a journal with his dead son's name written in it. The pages told a story that changed everything Jed thought he knew about what happened to his boy. But how did a stray dog know to lead him to the one place that held the truth he'd been searching for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence in these mountains could drive a lesser man to madness, but Jedediah Cole had learned to wear it like a comfortable old coat. 20 years he'd been living up here, perched on the side of Copper Ridge, like an eagle that had forgotten how to fly. His cabin sat tucked between two massive pines, weathered gray from decades of mountain storms, with a stone chimney that sent up thin ribbons of smoke most days of the year. Jed had built this place with his own hands after the war took his boy Thomas. Back then, his grief was a wild thing that needed containing, and these mountains provided the kind of solitude a man required when the world felt too sharp and too loud. The nearest neighbor was 40 miles down a logging road that barely deserved the name, and that was exactly how Jed preferred it. His daily routine had settled into a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Up before dawn to tend the wood stove, coffee black as midnight, in a tin cup that had seen better decades. He'd check his snares, hunt when the meat was running low, and spend his afternoons maintaining the cabin or reading from the handful of books he'd carried up here when civilization finally wore out its welcome. The brass compass he'd carried through his own war. Service still sat on the rough-hewn mantle, its face clouded with age, but its needle still true. Sometimes he'd hold it in his weathered hands and remember when direction meant something more than just knowing which way the wind was blowing. Back when he had a son to teach about reading the land, about finding your way home when the world tried to spin you around. Thomas had been 16 when Jed first brought him up to these mountains. The boy took to it like he was born for high country living, quick to learn which plants would keep you fed and which ones would put you in the ground. How to read weather in the way clouds gathered around the peaks, how to move through timber without disturbing so much as a twig. Those were good days, before the war came calling and took his boy away to foreign fields that had no business claiming American sons. The cabin was simple but solid. One large room with a sleeping area partitioned off by a heavy wool blanket, a kitchen that consisted of a wood stove and a dry sink. Shelves lined with mason jars full of preserved vegetables and meat. Jed had built everything oversized and sturdy, the way his father had taught him. Furniture that would outlast the man who made it. Joints fitted so tight they'd hold even when the wood aged and settled. Outside, a small barn housed his mule Bessie and enough hay to see her through the worst of winter. She was getting on in years, that mule, but she still had good sense and sure footing on rocky trails. Jed talked to her more than he talked to any human being, and Bessie seemed to prefer his company to that of her own kind, which suited them both just fine. The land around his cabin told stories if you knew how to read them. Deer trails winding through aspen groves, bear sign on the bark of cottonwoods, the subtle changes in vegetation that marked underground water sources. Jed had memorized every rock formation, every stand of timber, every meadow within a day's walk of his home. This was his domain, and he knew it better than some men knew their own wives. But for all his knowledge of this place, for all the peace he'd found in its rhythms, there remained a hollow space inside him that no amount of solitude could fill. Thomas had been everything to Jed after his wife Mary passed from the fever when the boy was just 12. Father and son against the world, learning together how to navigate life without her gentle presence to guide them. The war had taken Thomas just 2 months after his 18th birthday. Eager to serve, full of the kind of righteous fire that burned bright in young men who hadn't yet learned that the world was more complicated than the stories made it seem. Jed had tried to talk him out of enlisting, but Thomas had that stubborn streak that ran in the Cole bloodline like a seam of iron ore. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday in October, delivered by a solemn-faced boy from town who couldn't have been much younger than Thomas himself. "A killed in action," it said, as if those 3 words could contain the entirety of a life cut short. "Died heroically serving his country." Standard language that probably went out to hundreds of families, neat and clean and utterly inadequate. Jed had buried his grief in work after that, throwing himself into building this cabin, into learning every skill he'd need to live apart from a world that could snatch away everything you loved without warning or apology. He'd thought himself done with surprises, content to live out his remaining years in the company of mountains that didn't ask questions and seasons, that changed according to their own ancient schedule. The wounded dog's arrival had shattered that careful equilibrium. Like a rock through glass, it was just past sunset when the animal first appeared at the edge of his clearing. Jed was splitting kindling for the evening fire when he caught movement in his peripheral vision. The dog stood maybe 30 yards away, favoring its left rear leg, coat matted with burrs and what looked like dried blood. A shepherd mix of some kind, though its exact breeding was hard to determine. Under all that trail dirt, what struck Jed most wasn't the dog's condition. Injured animals wandered through his territory with fair regularity, but the way it looked at him. Those brown eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, a purposefulness that made the hair on the back of Jed's neck stand up. This wasn't some lost pet or feral dog looking for an easy meal. This animal had something on its mind. Jed set down his axe and studied the dog more carefully. Medium-sized, probably 40 or 50 pounds if it was properly fed. Its coat would likely be brown and black once it was cleaned up, with white markings on the chest and paws. The limp was pronounced, but not severe, painful rather than debilitating. The blood appeared to come from a gash along its left flank, probably from a run-in with something that objected to the dog's presence. For several minutes, man and dog regarded each other across the clearing. Jed had no particular fondness for domesticated animals beyond the practical relationship he maintained with Bessie. Dogs required care and attention, formed attachments that could complicate a man's life. This one, though, stirred something in him that he couldn't quite name. The dog took a tentative step forward, then another. It moved with the careful gait of an animal that had learned to manage pain without complaint. When it reached the midpoint of the clearing, it sat down and waited, as if asking permission to approach further, against every instinct that told him to send the animal on its way. Jed found himself walking toward his cabin door. He returned with a bowl of water and some leftover venison from his evening meal. The dog accepted both offerings with dignified gratitude, eating slowly despite what was clearly considerable hunger. As darkness settled over the mountains, Jed expected the dog to move on. Instead, it curled up near his porch steps, close enough to be under his protection, but far enough away to avoid crowding him. It was a tactful arrangement that spoke to an understanding of mountain etiquette that most humans never mastered. That night, Jed lay in his bunk listening to the familiar sounds of the high country, wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the crack of settling timber. But underneath it all was the quiet presence of something living that had chosen to stay near him. It had been years since anything had made that choice, and the feeling was both comforting and unsettling. When morning came, the dog was still there. The dog stayed for 3 days, accepting Jed's care with quiet dignity while its wounds began to heal. On the 4th morning, it started acting different, restless. It would walk to the edge of the clearing, look back at Jed with those intelligent eyes, then return to pace near the cabin steps. The message was clear as mountain spring water. It wanted him to follow. Jed tried ignoring the animal's behavior at first. He had work to do, winter preparations that couldn't wait for the whims of a stray dog. But every time he looked up from his tasks, there it was, standing at the tree line with an expression that seemed to say he was being stubborn about something important. By midday, the dog's agitation had grown pronounced enough that Jed finally set down his tools and walked over to where it waited. The moment he approached, the animal turned and headed into the forest with a purposefulness that brooked no argument. Its limp was much improved, though it still favored that left leg when the terrain got rough. Jed hesitated at the edge of his clearing. He'd spent 20 years avoiding unnecessary ventures into the deeper wilderness, content with the familiar territory around his cabin. This dog was asking him to step outside that safe boundary, to follow it into country he hadn't explored in decades. Every practical instinct told him to turn around and go back to his wood splitting, but something in the animal's behavior suggested this wasn't a casual invitation. The dog had traveled a considerable distance to reach his cabin, wounded and determined. Now it was leading him somewhere specific, and Jed found himself curious, despite his better judgment. The trail the dog chose wound through thick stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, following game paths that were barely visible to human eyes. Jed recognized some of the landmarks, a distinctive boulder formation here, a lightning-struck snag there, but they were heading into territory he hadn't visited since before Thomas died. The dog moved with confidence, occasionally looking back to make sure Jed was following, but never hesitating about the route. They climbed steadily for the better part of 2 hours, working their way up ridge lines that offered glimpses of the valley far below. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in shifting patterns of light and shadow, and the air carried the clean scent of pine resin and mountain streams. Under different circumstances, Jed might have enjoyed the hike. Today, though, anticipation sat in his stomach like a cold stone. The dog led him along a narrow deer trail that skirted the edge of a steep ravine, then up a series of switchbacks that brought them to a plateau Jed vaguely remembered from his early explorations of the area. The landscape here was different from the lower elevations, more open, with scattered stands of aspen and areas where winter avalanches had cleared away the larger trees. As they crested a small rise, the dog stopped and looked back at him with an expression that might have been satisfaction. Following its gaze, Jed saw what they'd come to find. The watchtower stood, or rather leaned, in a small clearing perhaps 100 yards ahead. Built from local stone and timber, it had been constructed during the war to serve as an observation post for spotting enemy aircraft. Most of these structures had been dismantled after the conflict ended, but this one sat so far from any road or settlement that the military had simply abandoned it to the elements. Time and weather had not been kind to the structure. The wooden portions of the tower had rotted away almost completely, leaving only the stone foundation and the lower walls intact. What remained looked more like ancient ruins than something built within living memory. Tall grass and young aspens had grown up around the base, giving the whole site an air of profound abandonment. Jed approached the ruins slowly, the dog padding beside him with obvious satisfaction. The structure was smaller than it had appeared from a distance, maybe 12 feet square at the base, with walls that had once risen 20 feet or more. Now the highest point was perhaps 8 feet above ground level, topped with a tangle of fallen timbers and rusted metal. The entrance was little more than a gap in the stonework, partially blocked by debris. The dog squeezed through without difficulty and disappeared into the shadowy interior. After a moment's hesitation, Jed followed. Inside, the ruins were a chaos of fallen beams, crumbling mortar, and years' worth of accumulated leaves and animal nests. Light filtered down through gaps in what remained of the roof, creating pools of illumination in the otherwise dim space. The dog was already at the far corner, pawing at something buried under a pile of rotted wood and debris. Jed worked his way across the unstable floor, testing each step carefully. The dog watched him approach, then stepped back as if to give him room to work. Whatever it had found was buried under several feet of accumulated debris, branches, stones, chunks of deteriorated timber. Jed began clearing the area methodically, his curiosity now fully engaged. What he uncovered made his breath catch in his throat. The journal was bound in cracked leather, its covers stained with moisture and age, but still intact. It had been wrapped in oiled cloth and placed inside what looked like a military ammunition box, protection that had kept it dry through decades of mountain weather. Jed lifted it out with hands that trembled slightly, brushing away years of accumulated dust and debris. On the cover, embossed in faded gold letters, were the words, "Property of Thomas Cole, 47th Infantry Regiment." For a long moment, Jed simply stared at the journal, unable to process what he was seeing. Thomas's name, his boy's handwriting, his son, who had supposedly died in some foreign field thousands of miles from these mountains, had somehow been here in this forgotten watchtower, long enough to hide a journal. The dog sat nearby, watching him with those intelligent eyes, as if it understood the significance of what had just been revealed. Jed's hands shook as he opened the journal's cover, revealing pages of familiar handwriting, Thomas's careful script. The way he formed his letters, just like his mother had taught him. The first entry was dated 3 months after Thomas had supposedly been killed in action. Jed sank to his knees in the debris-strewn floor of the ruined watchtower, the journal clutched against his chest. 20 years of carefully constructed acceptance crumbled away in an instant. Thomas had been alive. He'd been here in these mountains, writing in this journal. Months after the telegram had arrived, declaring him dead, the dog moved closer and settled beside him, as if offering comfort for a grief that was suddenly raw and fresh again. Jed looked down at the animal with new understanding. This wasn't just some lost dog that had wandered into his clearing by chance. Somehow this animal was connected to Thomas. It had known where to find the journal, had led him here with the purposefulness of a creature fulfilling a long-delayed mission. Through the blur of tears he hadn't shed in decades, Jed began to read his son's words, written in his own hand, telling a story that would change everything he thought he knew about what had happened to his boy. The sun was setting by the time Jed finally closed the journal and looked up to find the dog still watching him patiently. Whatever answers Thomas's words held, whatever truth had been hidden in this forgotten place for 20 years, it was too much to process in the fading light of a single afternoon. But one thing was already clear: his son's story was far from over. And this dog, this unlikely messenger, had brought him the first chapter of a truth he was only beginning to understand. Sleep proved impossible that night. Jed sat in his one comfortable chair by the wood stove, the journal open on his lap, reading by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. The dog had settled on a blanket near the fire, as if it belonged there, as if it had always been part of his mountain routine. Thomas's words jumped off the page with an immediacy that made Jed's chest tight. His boy's voice, captured in careful script, telling a story that grew more troubling with each entry. November 15th. We've been moving for 6 days now. Johnson says we're going to make a stand at Miller's Creek, but half the men are sick and the other half are ready to run. I keep thinking about those mountains back home, about how clean the air tastes up there. This place smells like death and mud. November 18th. Lost 3 more men today. Reynolds stepped on something that blew his leg clean off. McKenna just sat down by the side of the road and wouldn't get up. Captain Sterling had him shot for desertion. I'm starting to understand why some men choose to walk away. November 22nd, found out what happened to the Morrison unit. They sent them to take a hill that wasn't worth taking, and now they're all feeding the crows. 87 boys from Nebraska and Kansas, dead for a piece of ground we abandoned 2 days later. This whole war is madness dressed up in patriotic speeches. Jed had to stop reading several times, the lamplight blurring as emotions he'd kept buried for 2 decades fought their way to the surface. This wasn't the noble sacrifice the telegram had described. This was his boy, barely 18 years old, watching friends die for no good reason in a conflict that seemed to have lost any sense of purpose. The dog lifted its head occasionally, as if sensing Jed's distress, but made no move to interrupt. It seemed to understand that this was necessary work, this painful reunion with words from beyond the grave. December 3rd. Patterson showed me a photograph today. His little sister back in Ohio, maybe 14 years old, standing by a fence with a smile that could light up a room. He carries it everywhere, talks about her like she's the only good thing left in the world. Made me think of Pa, up there in his mountains, probably wondering why I haven't written. Truth is, I don't know what to tell him about this place. How do you explain to someone who taught you to honor life that you're surrounded by people whose job is ending it? The mention of himself brought fresh tears to Jed's eyes. He remembered waiting for letters that never came, checking with the postal service in town every few weeks, telling himself that no news was good news. He'd assumed Thomas was too busy fighting to write, never imagining his boy was struggling with what to say to a father he'd always looked up to. As dawn approached, Jed found himself studying a photograph that had been tucked between the journal's pages. The image was faded and creased, but he could make out 5 young men in military uniforms standing in front of what looked like a supply tent. Thomas was on the left, thinner than Jed remembered but still recognizable. The other 4 faces were strangers, but their eyes held the same haunted look he'd seen in veterans who'd made it, home from other wars. What struck him most was that someone had deliberately scratched out 3 of the faces with what looked like a knife point, leaving only Thomas and one other soldier clearly visible. The remaining face belonged to a lean young man with dark hair and serious eyes, standing close enough to Thomas to suggest friendship. Jed turned the photograph over and found an inscription in Thomas's handwriting. "Me and Daniels at Camp Harrison, before everything went to hell. The others don't matter anymore." The bitterness in those last words chilled him. What had happened to make his boys scratch out the faces of his fellow soldiers? What had driven a wedge between men who should have been brothers in arms? The dog stirred as morning light began filtering through the cabin windows, stretching and looking at Jed expectantly. It had been patient through the long night, but now its body language suggested it was ready for action. Ready perhaps to continue the story that Thomas's journal had begun. Jed closed the journal carefully and set it on the table beside his chair. His back ached from sitting hunched over the pages all night, and his eyes burned from reading by lamplight. But something had shifted inside him during those hours of painful discovery. The careful numbness he'd cultivated for 20 years was cracking apart, replaced by something raw and urgent. Thomas had been alive for months after that telegram arrived. His boy had survived whatever battle the military claimed had killed him, had lived long enough to write dozens of journal entries, had somehow made his way back to these mountains. The implications of that simple fact were staggering. How many other families had received similar telegrams? How many sons had been declared dead while they were still drawing breath? And why would the military lie about such things? Jed stood slowly, joints protesting after the long night in his chair. The dog rose as well, tail wagging slightly as if pleased that they were finally moving again. It walked to the door and looked back at him with obvious expectation. "Not yet, old friend," Jed said, surprised by the sound of his own voice after hours of silence. "I need to understand more before we go anywhere else." But even as he spoke the words, he was reaching for the journal again. The dog settled back down with what might have been patience, but its alert posture suggested it was ready to resume their journey at a moment's notice. Jed opened the journal to where he'd left off, and Thomas's voice reached across 20 years to continue his story. December 10th. "Daniels and me talked about it for hours last night. The others are planning something, but they won't say what. Richardson keeps talking about evening the score and teaching the brass a lesson. I don't like the look in his eyes when he says it. Some men get drunk on violence, and once they start down that path, there's no pulling them back." December 15th. It happened today. Richardson and the others went too far, and now we're all going to pay for it. They killed Lieutenant Morrison while he was sleeping, said he had it coming for getting his men killed. Maybe he did, but murder is murder, no matter how you dress it up. Daniels and me tried to stop them, but we were outnumbered. Now we're all deserters and murderers in the eyes of the army, guilty by association if nothing else. December 18th. We're running now. Left camp 3 nights ago and been moving ever since. Richardson thinks we can make it to Mexico, but I know better. They'll catch us eventually, and when they do, we'll face a firing squad. Daniels agrees with me. We've been talking about splitting off from the others, trying to make it home on our own. At least if we're going to die, we can die in country that means something to us. Jed's hands tightened on the journal as the full scope of Thomas's situation became clear. His boy hadn't just deserted. He'd been caught up in a murder, forced to run with men whose violence had made them all targets. The weight of that knowledge settled on Jed's shoulders like a physical burden. The dog watched him read, brown eyes patient but alert. Somehow, this animal knew the rest of the story, and when Jed was ready to hear it, it would lead him to the next chapter. 3 days passed before Jed worked up the courage to continue reading. The journal sat on his kitchen table like an unexploded shell, filled with truths he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The dog remained patient but watchful, occasionally walking to the door and looking back at him with those knowing eyes. When Jed finally opened the journal again, he found something that made his breath catch, a crude map drawn in the margins of one page, sketched in pencil with careful attention to detail. The landmarks were unmistakable: Copper Ridge, Devil's Canyon, the distinctive rock formation locals called the Sleeping Giant. This was his country, the mountains he'd called home for 20 years. Someone had marked specific locations with small X's, and notes were scribbled beside them in Thomas's handwriting: water source, good shelter, hidden from road. But what drew Jed's attention was a larger X, near what looked like Devil's Ridge, with a notation that made his stomach clench. Final camp, D buried here. D had to be Daniels, the friend from the photograph. Thomas had made it home to these mountains, but he hadn't made the journey alone. January 3rd. We've been in the high country for 2 weeks now. Daniels is holding up better than I expected, but the cold is getting to both of us. Found an old cave system near Devil's Ridge that should keep us hidden through the worst of winter. The army won't follow us up here, not in this weather. Maybe we'll have time to figure out what comes next. January 8th. Daniels has been coughing for 3 days straight. Started as just a cold, but it's getting worse. I've been brewing pine needle tea like Pa taught me, but it's not helping much. We need real medicine, but that would mean going down to town, and that's too dangerous. They're probably watching every settlement within 100 miles. January 15th. Made contact with someone today. An old trapper named Mackenzie, who has a cabin about 5 miles south of here. He doesn't ask questions, which suits us fine. Traded him Daniels' watch for some canned goods and a bottle of whiskey. The whiskey's not for drinking, it's the only antiseptic we can get. Jed knew Mackenzie by reputation. The old trapper had died at least 15 years ago, which meant Thomas's timeline was consistent with what he'd already read. His boy and his friend had made it to these mountains in the dead of winter, sick and hunted, trying to survive on skills Thomas had learned during their hunting trips together. The thought of his son hiding in caves, slowly starving, while Jed sat in his comfortable cabin just a few ridges away, was almost unbearable. If only Thomas had come home. If only he'd trusted his father enough to ask for help. January 22nd, Daniels died this morning. The cough turned into something worse, and there wasn't anything I could do for him. He went peaceful, at least. His last words were about his sister back in Ohio, how he hoped she'd understand why he couldn't come home. I buried him on the ridge above our camp under a pile of stones that should keep the scavengers away. Now I'm alone up here, and I'm not sure how much longer I can hold out. January 28th, found a dog today. Half-starved shepherd mix that wandered into camp like it was looking for something. Reminded me of that hound Pa and me found when I was 12, the one with the hurt paw that stayed with us all summer. This one's got kind eyes and doesn't seem afraid of humans. I've been sharing my food with him, and he's been good company. Funny how much difference it makes, having something alive to talk to. Jed looked over at the dog by his fire, recognition dawning like sunrise. The animal was older now, grayed around the muzzle and moving more carefully than it would have 20 years ago, but the eyes were the same. This was Thomas's dog, the companion who'd shared his final months in these mountains. The pieces were starting to fit together. The dog had lived with Thomas, had probably been with him when he died. For 20 years, it had been guarding whatever remained of his boy's story, waiting for the right moment to lead someone to the truth. Waiting for Jed. You've been carrying this burden a long time, haven't you, old friend? Jed said softly. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and its tail gave a tentative wag. February 10th. The dog's been acting strange for the past few days. Restless. He keeps walking to the edge of camp and looking down toward the valley, like he's expecting something. Maybe he can sense what I've been feeling, that our time up here is running out. The army's persistent when they want to be, and deserters don't just disappear, even in country this rough. February 18th. They found us. I saw the smoke from their camp yesterday morning, maybe 2 miles down the ridge. 3 men, moving careful like they know what they're doing. Military hunters, the kind they send after deserters who've caused them embarrassment. They'll be here by tomorrow, maybe the day after. I've got decisions to make. Jed's hands were shaking as he turned the page. The next entry was written in a different ink, with the careful deliberation of a man who knew he might not have many words left. February 20th. This is probably my last entry. The soldiers made camp at Willow Creek last night, close enough that I could see their fire. They'll find our cave by noon tomorrow, and then it'll be over. I'm not going to run anymore. I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of living like an animal in country that should feel like home. I want Pa to know that I tried to be the man he raised me to be. The killing in the war wasn't my choice, and the desertion wasn't cowardice. It was the only honorable thing left to do. Daniels understood that. The dog understands it too in his way. Animals know things about right and wrong that humans forget sometimes. If anyone ever finds this journal, tell my father that I died thinking about those summer mornings we spent fishing Granite Creek before the world got complicated. Tell him I never stopped loving these mountains or him. Tell him that some fights are worth losing if you lose them for the right reasons. The dog's gonna survive this. He's smart and careful, and he knows this country now. Maybe someday he'll find his way to Pa's cabin. Maybe he'll help Pa understand what really happened up here. Dogs are good at showing people things they need to see. The next page was blank. Jed stared at it for a long time, then closed the journal carefully. His boy's voice had gone silent again, but the story wasn't finished. The dog sat watching him, patient as stone, waiting for him to understand what came next. Outside, storm clouds were gathering around the peaks, and the wind was picking up. Weather was coming, the kind of late-season blow that could trap a man for days. But Jed was already reaching for his pack, already planning the supplies he'd need for a journey into the high country. The dog stood and walked to the door, tail wagging with quiet satisfaction. After 20 years of waiting, it was finally time to finish what Thomas had started. The journey to Devil's Ridge took the better part of 2 days, even with the dog leading the way, along paths that seemed to exist only in its memory. Jed had packed light but thorough, enough food for a week, his sleeping roll, basic medical supplies, and the tools a man needed for digging in rocky ground. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavier on his shoulders than his pack. They climbed through country that grew wilder with each mile, leaving behind the familiar territory around Jed's cabin for landscapes he'd avoided since Thomas's supposed death. The dog moved with purpose despite its age, following game trails so faint they were nearly invisible, leading them around obstacles and toward destinations only it could see. On the morning of the second day, they crested a ridge that offered a clear view of Devil's Canyon spread out below them. The formation earned its name honestly. Jagged rock walls dropped away into shadows so deep they seemed to swallow light itself. Ancient rock slides had carved the landscape into a maze of boulders and hidden passages. The kind of country where a man could disappear completely if he knew what he was doing. The dog led him down a switchbacking trail that hugged the canyon wall, moving with the careful confidence of an animal that had traveled this route many times before. Jed followed, fighting the vertigo that came with looking down into those depths. Trusting the dog's knowledge of safe passage, they found the first campsite in a sheltered alcove, maybe halfway down the canyon wall. Someone had built a fire ring from local stones, and the remains of a lean-to shelter still clung to the rock face, like the bones of something long dead. Jed recognized the construction, the efficient, minimal approach to wilderness living he'd taught Thomas during their hunting trips, but it was what he found scattered around the campsite that made his chest tighten with recognition. A bent tin cup, the kind soldiers carried in their field kits. A piece of leather that had once been part of a military belt, and partially buried under a drift of old leaves, the tarnished metal of military dog tags. Jed brushed the dirt away from the tags with trembling fingers. The metal was corroded but still readable. Daniels, Robert J., 47th Infantry Regiment. Below that, barely visible, was a serial number and blood type. This was Thomas's friend, the serious-faced young man from the photograph. The dog watched him examine the tags, then moved to a spot near the back of the alcove and began scratching at the ground. Jed followed and knelt beside the animal, using his knife to probe the earth where the dog indicated. A few inches down, his blade struck something that wasn't stone. Working carefully, Jed uncovered what appeared to be a deliberate cache, military supplies wrapped in oiled canvas and buried in a natural depression in the rock. Inside the bundle were items that told the story of desperate men trying to survive in hostile country, ammunition for rifles they no longer carried, field rations that had probably been stolen from army supplies. A small medical kit with most of its contents used up. At the bottom of the cache, wrapped separately in what had once been a piece of uniform fabric, was a letter. The paper was brown with age and moisture, but Thomas's handwriting was still legible across the top. For Robert's sister in Ohio, if anyone finds this, Jed unfolded the letter carefully, aware that he was intruding on a private grief 20 years in the making. Thomas's words were measured and formal, the kind of letter a young man writes when he knows it might be the last thing he ever says about a friend. Dear Miss Daniels, your brother Robert died on January 28th in the mountains of Montana. He was not a deserter or a coward, no matter what the army might tell you. He was a good man who made hard choices when the world offered him nothing but bad ones. He talked about you every day we were together up here. He wanted you to know that he never stopped loving you, and that everything he did was to protect something decent in a world that had forgotten what decency looked like. Robert died of sickness, not violence. He went peaceful, and I buried him proper on the ridge above our camp. If you ever want to visit his grave, look for the stone cairn on Devil's Ridge in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. It's a beautiful spot, the kind of place where a soul can rest easy. I'm sorry I can't deliver this letter in person. By the time anyone reads it, I'll probably be gone too. But I wanted someone to know the truth about what happened to us up here. We weren't heroes, but we weren't villains either. We were just boys who got caught up in something bigger than we could handle, and we did the best we could with what we had. Your brother was brave, Miss Daniels. Remember him that way. Thomas Cole, 47th Infantry Regiment. Jed folded the letter with the same care Thomas had used to preserve it, then slipped it into his jacket pocket. Somewhere in Ohio, if she was still alive, Robert Daniels had a sister who'd never received word of how her brother really died. She'd probably spent 20 years wondering, maybe hoping he'd someday walk through her door with an explanation for his long absence. The dog had moved to the edge of the alcove and was looking up the canyon wall with obvious expectation. There was more to see, more pieces of the story waiting to be uncovered. Jed repacked the cache carefully, leaving everything as close to its original state as possible, then shouldered his pack and prepared to follow his guide to the next revelation. As they climbed higher into the canyon, Jed found himself thinking about the weight of secrets. For 20 years, this place had held the truth about what happened to Thomas and his friend. While families below grieved for sons they'd never really understood. The army had written its official version of events, neat and clean and utterly false. Meanwhile, the real story waited in hidden caches and forgotten campsites, preserved by time and the faithful memory of an old dog. The trail grew steeper as they climbed, winding between massive boulders that had fallen from the canyon rim sometime in the distant past. The dog's pace never faltered, though Jed could see the effort the climb was costing the aging animal. They were both getting too old for this kind of adventure. But some journeys couldn't be postponed any longer. Near the top of the canyon wall, the dog led him to another sheltered spot, this one larger and more carefully concealed than the first. Someone had spent considerable time here, weeks, maybe months. The remains of a more substantial shelter were still visible, built into a natural cave that extended back into the rock face. This was where Thomas had written the final entries in his journal. This was where he'd waited for the soldiers to find him, with only an old dog for company and the Montana sky overhead. Standing in that place, Jed could almost feel his son's presence, could almost hear the echo of a young man's voice speaking final words to mountains that had always listened without judgment. The cave extended much deeper into the mountainside than Jed had expected. What looked like a simple shelter from outside opened into a network of connected chambers carved by water over countless centuries. The dog led him past the obvious front chamber, where casual visitors might shelter from weather, back into passages that required a man to duck his head and watch his footing on uneven stone. In the third chamber, someone had created something that bordered on permanent residence. Military blankets were still stretched between rock projections to create partitioned sleeping areas. Empty cans were stacked neatly in one corner, and the remains of a cooking area showed signs of regular use over an extended period. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was where desperate men had tried to build something like a life while the world hunted them. The dog moved with familiar confidence through the space, leading Jed to a natural alcove near the back of the chamber. Someone had used this area for storage, stacking supplies and personal items in a way that suggested they planned to return. Military packs hung from rock projections, and wooden crates bore the stenciled markings of Army quartermaster units. Jed examined the crates more closely and realized what he was looking at. These weren't just personal supplies. They represented enough food, ammunition, and equipment to sustain several men for months. Either Thomas and Daniels had been remarkably successful thieves, or they'd had help from someone with access to military stockpiles. The answer lay in papers tucked into one of the military packs, orders and requisition forms, all bearing the signature of someone called Sergeant McKenna, Quartermaster Corps. Jed recognized the name from Thomas's journal. McKenna was one of the soldiers who'd been part of the original group. One of the faces scratched out of the photograph. As he read through the documents, a clearer picture emerged. McKenna had been systematically stealing supplies from army stores and passing them to the deserters in exchange for something that wasn't immediately clear from the paperwork. The dates on the requisitions extended over several months, suggesting an ongoing arrangement rather than a one-time deal. At the bottom of the stack, Jed found a letter written in unfamiliar handwriting. The signature read S. McKenna, and the contents made his stomach turn. Thomas, the situation down here is getting worse. They're asking questions about the missing supplies, and I can't keep covering for much longer. Richardson and his boys are talking about hitting the payroll wagon next month, and they want you and Daniels to help. I told them you're not interested in that kind of work, but they're not taking no for an answer. I think it's time you boys moved on. Head deeper into the mountains, find somewhere they can't follow. I'll keep sending supplies as long as I can, but you need to be ready to disappear completely if things go sideways. Watch your backs. Richardson's been drinking too much and saying things that make me nervous. He blames you and Daniels for the lieutenant getting killed. Says if you'd backed their play, instead of trying to stop it, none of this would have happened. Drunk men with grudges do stupid things. Burn this letter after you read it. The letter was dated a week before Thomas's final journal entry. Jed folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket alongside the letter meant for Daniels's sister. The pieces of the story were falling into place, and they painted a picture more complex than simple desertion. Thomas and Daniels hadn't just been running from the army. They'd been running from their former companions as well. The men who'd committed murder and dragged them into the conspiracy were still hunting them, along with a quartermaster sergeant who'd been playing all sides while military supplies disappeared into the wilderness. The dog had settled near the entrance to the chamber, watching Jed work through the implications of what they'd discovered. When he looked up from the papers, the animal's expression seemed almost expectant, as if it knew there were more revelations waiting to be uncovered. Moving deeper into the cache, Jed found personal items that brought Thomas's final months into sharp focus. A razor and small mirror, carefully maintained despite the circumstances. Sewing supplies used to repair clothes and equipment. A deck of playing cards so worn they were barely recognizable. Evidence of long winter nights when two young men had nothing to do but wait and worry. Most affecting were the small attempts at normalcy scattered throughout their supplies. Someone had carved chess pieces from pine wood, complete with a makeshift board scratched into a flat stone. A harmonica sat wrapped in cloth, its metal surface polished smooth by handling. These were the tools desperate men used to maintain their sanity when the world had stripped away everything else that made life worth living. In the deepest part of the cache, Jed found Thomas's rifle, the same model Winchester his son had carried on their hunting trips together. It was clean and well-maintained, ready for use, with a full magazine of cartridges and boxes of ammunition stacked nearby. Whoever had been hunting Thomas and Daniels, his boy had been prepared to make a stand when the time came. Beside the rifle, wrapped in oiled leather, was something that made Jed's breath catch in his throat. His own letters to Thomas, the ones he'd written during the first months after his son left for war. He'd wondered why Thomas never responded to them, had assumed they'd been lost in the chaos of military mail service. Instead, they'd found their way here, to this hidden chamber in the Montana mountains, where his boy had read them during the longest nights of his life. The letters were worn from handling, creased and recreased, as if Thomas had read them countless times. In the margins of one, written in his son's familiar handwriting, were words that brought tears to Jed's eyes. "Wish I could tell him the truth. Wish I could come home." The dog rose and moved to Jed's side, as if sensing his emotional state. It pressed against his leg with gentle insistence, offering the kind of comfort one living creature gives another in moments of profound grief. For several minutes, man and dog sat together in the shadows of the cave, connected by their shared loss and their mutual devotion to Thomas's memory. When Jed finally composed himself enough to continue, he found one last item hidden in the very back of the cache, a small wooden box, carved with the same care Thomas had always brought to his woodworking projects. Inside, wrapped in silk that had probably come from his mother's sewing basket, was a photograph of Jed and Thomas together on Granite Creek, taken during their last fishing trip before the war changed everything. On the back of the photograph, in Thomas's careful script, were the words, "For Pa, when someone finally tells him what really happened up here. I never stopped being proud to be your son." The dog was already moving toward the cave entrance, ready to continue their journey to whatever final revelation waited in this mountain sanctuary. But Jed remained kneeling in the shadows for a few more minutes, holding the photograph and feeling the presence of his son in this place where love and desperation had carved out a small space for hope in the midst of a world gone mad. The dog led him to the final cache just as storm clouds began gathering around the mountain peaks. This hiding place was different from the others, smaller, more carefully concealed, and positioned with a clear view of the approaches to the cave system. It was the kind of spot a man would choose if he needed to watch for enemies while keeping his most precious possessions safe. What Jed found that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The cache contained official military documents, but these weren't stolen supplies or forged papers. These were orders, reports, and correspondence bearing the seal of the United States Army and signed by officers whose ranks made Jed's blood run cold. Colonels, generals, men with the authority to rewrite history according to their convenience. The first document was a field report dated 3 days after Thomas's final journal entry, written by someone called Captain Morrison. Military Police Division. Its contents were precise and bureaucratic, the kind of language administrators used when they wanted to distance themselves from ugly realities. Subject: apprehension and disposition of deserters from 47th Infantry Regiment on February 23rd. This unit successfully located and apprehended 5 deserters who had been operating in the Bitterroot Mountain region for approximately 3 months. Subjects were found in possession of stolen military property valued at over $2,000, including weapons, ammunition, and quartermaster supplies. Due to the remote location and severe weather conditions, immediate transport to military tribunal was not feasible. Under the authority granted by General Order 67, field justice was administered according to military law governing desertion during wartime. All 5 subjects were executed by firing squad on February 24th at 800 hours. Bodies were interred in unmarked graves at the site of apprehension to prevent the location from becoming a shrine for other potential deserters. Families of the deceased will be notified that their relatives died heroically in action against enemy forces. This classification serves both to maintain morale on the home front and to discourage other soldiers from following their example. Signed, Captain J. Morrison. Military Police Division. Jed read the document 3 times before its full meaning sank in. Thomas hadn't died in battle against foreign enemies. He'd been executed by his own army, along with Daniels and 3 other young men, for the crime of refusing to continue fighting in a war that had already claimed too many lives. The heroic death described in the telegram Jed had received 20 years ago was a complete fabrication, designed to hide the fact that the military had murdered his son and covered up the execution with lies. But that wasn't the worst of it. The next document in the cache was a letter from someone much higher up the chain of command. Someone with enough authority to orchestrate cover-ups on a massive scale. The letterhead read, Office of the Secretary of War, and the signature belonged to a name Jed recognized from newspaper articles about political figures in Washington. Captain Morrison. Your report regarding the disposition of the 5 deserters has been reviewed and approved. The decision to classify their deaths as combat casualties was correct, and serves the greater good of maintaining military discipline and civilian morale. However, there are concerns about potential complications arising from this incident. The families of these men may ask questions, particularly if they attempt to recover the bodies for proper burial. Under no circumstances should the actual location of the graves be revealed. Furthermore, there are indications that at least one of the deserters may have documented their activities during the period they were absent from duty. Any such documentation should be considered classified material and destroyed if discovered. You are hereby ordered to return to the site of execution and conduct a thorough search for any written materials the subjects may have hidden. This search should extend to any caves, shelters, or caches they may have established during their time in the wilderness. The integrity of this operation depends on absolute secrecy. No written records of your return mission should be maintained, and all personnel involved should be reminded of their oath of military secrecy. Signed, name redacted. Secretary of War Jed's hands were shaking as he read the final documents in the cache. They were Thomas's own words, but not from his journal. These were loose pages, written in a different hand than the careful script Jed had grown accustomed to reading. The writing was hurried, desperate, the work of a man who knew his time was running out. February 23rd, they found us this morning, 3 soldiers and an officer, moving up the canyon with the kind of systematic approach that means they know exactly where they're going. Someone told them about our camp, probably McKenna trying to save his own skin. Daniels and me talked about running, but there's nowhere left to go. The weather's turned bad, and we're both too weak from the winter to make it much farther. Besides, I'm tired of running. If this is how it ends, at least it'll be in country that feels like home. They gave us until morning to surrender. Said they'd take us back for a proper trial, but I can see the truth in their eyes. They didn't come all this way up here to take prisoners. They came to clean up a mess, and we're the mess. I'm writing this in case someone finds it someday. Maybe Pa, if he ever comes looking. I want him to know that I wasn't a coward, and I wasn't a criminal. I was just a boy who couldn't keep killing people for reasons nobody could explain to my satisfaction. The dog's been acting strange all day. Keeps trying to get me to follow him somewhere, like he knows what's coming and wants to help me hide. Smart animal. Smarter than the humans in this situation. If someone's reading this, it means the army lied about what happened to us. We didn't die in battle. We died because we chose our conscience over our orders, and the military couldn't let that kind of thinking spread. Tell my father I love him. Tell him I tried to be the man he raised me to be. The final page was written in a different hand. Daniel's, Jed realized, recognizing the style from notes he'd found in the cave cache. February 24th. They're coming up the trail now. 5 of them, armed and moving with purpose. Thomas is sitting by the fire, calm as mountain stone. He says, we're going to meet this standing up like men. Says his father taught him that some things are worth dying for. I'm scared, but not of dying. I'm scared that nobody will ever know we tried to do the right thing. That history will remember us as cowards and criminals instead of soldiers who couldn't stomach murdering innocent people anymore. The dog ran off an hour ago. Maybe he'll survive this. Maybe someday he'll find someone who can understand what really happened up here. If there's a God, I hope he's kinder to us than the United States Army has been. Jed closed his eyes and pressed the papers against his chest, feeling the weight of 20 years of lies and the terrible price his son had paid for choosing conscience over convenience. The military hadn't just killed Thomas. They'd stolen his honor, turned his moral courage into a shameful secret that families weren't allowed to grieve properly. The dog was watching him from the entrance to the cache, brown eyes patient but alert. It had been guarding these documents for 2 decades, waiting for someone with the authority to hear Thomas's true story, waiting for a father who deserved to know how his son really died. Thunder rolled across the mountains as the first drops of rain began to fall. Storm weather was coming, the kind that could trap a man for days if he wasn't careful about where he took shelter. But Jed wasn't ready to seek cover yet. There was one more revelation waiting, one final piece of the story that would complete his understanding of what had happened in these mountains 20 years ago. The dog rose and looked toward a stand of aspen trees growing near the edge of the plateau. Somewhere beyond those trees, Thomas Cole and Robert Daniels had faced their final morning, had stood up to meet their executioners with whatever dignity young men could muster when the world had abandoned them. Jed folded the execution documents carefully and placed them inside his jacket, next to the letters and photographs he'd already collected. Tomorrow, he would decide what to do with the truth he'd discovered. Tonight, he needed to find his son's grave and say the words that should have been spoken 20 years ago. The rain started in earnest as Jed followed the dog through the aspen grove, each drop striking the leaves with a sound like whispered secrets. The storm had been building all afternoon, and now the mountains were releasing the tension they'd been holding in gathering clouds and electric air. Lightning flickered in the distance, still miles away but moving closer with the measured inevitability of mountain weather. The dog moved with renewed purpose, no longer the patient guide it had been for the past several days. Its pace was urgent now, as if it understood that they were approaching the end of a journey that had taken 20 years to complete. Jed struggled to keep up, his legs heavy with exhaustion and his heart heavier still with the weight of what he'd learned in the hidden cache. They climbed steadily through terrain that grew more rugged with each step. The aspen gave way to scattered pines, then to bare rock and hardy mountain grasses that bent before the increasing wind. This was country that rarely saw human visitors, too high and remote for casual hikers, too harsh for anyone who didn't have compelling reasons to be there. The dog led him to a ridge that offered a commanding view of the entire canyon system they'd been exploring. From this vantage point, Jed could see why Thomas and Daniels had chosen this area for their final stand. Any approach would be visible for miles, giving them time to prepare for whatever came next. It was the kind of tactical thinking he'd tried to teach Thomas during their hunting trips. Lessons in reading terrain and choosing positions that he'd hoped his son would never need to use. Below them, partially hidden by a cluster of wind-twisted pines, Jed could make out what looked like the remains of a military camp. Canvas scraps fluttered from broken poles, and the geometric patterns of disturbed earth suggested tents and equipment that had long since been scattered by weather and time. This was where Captain Morrison and his men had made their base while hunting the deserters. Close enough to watch the cave system, but far enough away to avoid detection. The dog paused at the edge of the ridge, looking back at Jed with an expression that seemed to ask if he was ready for what came next. 20 years of questions were about to be answered. 20 years of grief and uncertainty were about to be resolved with a finality that would change everything he thought he knew about loss and love and the price of moral courage. Jed nodded to the dog, and they began the descent toward the valley floor. The trail was treacherous in the rain, loose rocks made slippery by water and moss. Jed had to concentrate on each step, using his walking stick to test uncertain footing while the dog moved ahead with the sure confidence of an animal that had traveled this route many times before. The storm was intensifying, lightning now close enough that thunder followed only seconds after each flash. And Jed could smell the ozone scent that meant the worst of the weather was still to come. Halfway down the slope, the dog stopped at what appeared to be a natural shelter formed by an overhanging rock ledge. Someone had improved the space with carefully placed stones, creating a windbreak that would offer protection from the worst of mountain storms. Inside the shelter, arranged with military precision, were the remains of what had clearly been a final campsite. 2 sleeping areas were still visible, marked by flattened earth and the remnants of bedrolls that had been arranged side by side. A cold fire ring sat between them, filled with ashes that had somehow survived 20 years of weather. Personal items were scattered around the space with the careful organization of men who knew they might need to move quickly, but wanted their final camp to feel like something approaching. Home, Jed found Thomas's harmonica resting on a flat stone near one of the sleeping areas, polished clean and positioned where his son could have reached it easily during those final nights. Beside it was a small leather-bound book that Jed recognized, Psalms, the same edition Mary had given Thomas for his confirmation. The pages were warped with moisture but still readable, and several passages were marked with careful underlines. In the other sleeping area, Jed discovered items that must have belonged to Daniels. A photograph of a young woman who was probably his sister in Ohio. A carved wooden cross and a letter that had been read so many times, the creases had nearly separated the paper into fragments. The letter was from home, full of news about harvest and family gatherings and all the ordinary joys that make life worth living. These weren't the possessions of cowards or criminals. These were the treasured belongings of young men who had held onto their humanity even as the world tried to strip it away from them. Men who had read scripture and looked at photographs of loved ones and played music to comfort themselves during the darkest nights of their lives. The dog had moved to the far edge of the shelter and was pawing at something buried under a pile of carefully arranged stones. Jed followed and knelt beside the animal, beginning to clear away the rocks with hands that trembled from more than just the cold rain. What he uncovered made his breath catch in his throat. It was Thomas's final letter, sealed in a waterproof pouch and weighted down with stones to keep it safe from scavengers and weather. The outside of the pouch bore an inscription in his son's careful handwriting, "For my father, Jedediah Cole, Copper Ridge, Montana. To be delivered only if I don't survive to tell him myself." Jed held the letter for a long time before opening it, watching rain cascade off the rock overhang while lightning illuminated the valley in stark, momentary clarity. This was the moment he'd been traveling toward, since the wounded dog first appeared at his cabin. Everything else, the journal, the caches, the hidden documents, had been preparation for the words Thomas had chosen as his final gift to the father he'd never see again. When he finally broke the seal and unfolded the letter, Thomas's voice reached across 20 years of silence to speak directly to his heart. "Pa, if you're reading this, it means the dog found you like I hoped he would. His name is Ranger, and he's been the best friend a man could ask for during these final months. I've told him about you, about our cabin, about the life I wish I could have come back to. He understands more than most people would give him credit for. I need you to know that everything I did up here was guided by the lessons you taught me about right and wrong. You raised me to stand up for what I believed in, even when it cost me something. You taught me that a man's honor was more important than his comfort, and that some principles are worth dying for. The army will tell you I died heroically in battle, but that's not the truth. The truth is, I died because I refused to keep killing people in a war that stopped making sense the moment I saw what it was really about. I chose desertion over murder, conscience over orders, and I'd make the same choice again if I had to. Daniels and me have been living up here like the mountain men you used to tell me stories about, making do with what we had, and finding peace in country that doesn't ask questions. It's been hard, but it's also been honest in a way the war never was. We've had time to think, time to remember who we were before the army tried to turn us into something else. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of being forgotten or worse, of being remembered for the wrong reasons. If anyone ever asks about Thomas Cole, tell them he was a young man who loved these mountains and tried to live by the values his father taught him. Tell them he chose love over hate, peace over violence, truth over convenience. The dog will show you where they buried us. We've known for days that they were coming, and we're ready. Daniels and me talked about running one more time, but this is where our story ends. These mountains are where I learned everything important about being a man, and it feels right to give my life back to them. Take care of Ranger for me. He's earned a warm fire and regular meals, and he knows things about loyalty that most humans never learn. He'll be good company for you, better than you might expect. I love you, Pa. I've loved you every day I've been up here, and I'll love you from whatever comes after this. Don't grieve for me longer than you have to. I've been happier in these mountains than I ever was in the army, and I'm going to my death knowing I tried to do the right thing. Your son, Thomas P.S. There's something hidden under the big rock near Devil's Creek. Ranger will show you. It's for you to decide what to do with, but I think the families deserve to know the truth about what happened to their sons. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the rock overhang with increasing intensity. Lightning struck somewhere close by, close enough that the thunder was instantaneous and the smell of split wood drifted down from the ridge above them. Jed folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his jacket with the other documents he'd collected, then looked at Ranger with new understanding. The dog had been waiting 20 years to complete this mission, to deliver Thomas's final words to the father who deserved to hear them. It had guarded the truth through 2 decades of mountain winters, protecting the evidence that would eventually clear the names of 5 young men who had died for choosing honor over obedience. Ranger moved to the entrance of the shelter and looked out at the storm-lashed valley, then back at Jed with patient expectation. There was one more revelation waiting, one final destination in their journey toward understanding. Somewhere near Devil's Creek, Thomas had hidden something that would complete the story and give Jed the power to decide how that story should be told to the world. The storm was reaching its peak, with lightning strikes so frequent they turned the valley into a stroboscopic landscape of sharp shadows and brilliant illumination. But Ranger was already moving, heading out into the weather, with the determination of an animal that had promised to see this mission through to the end. Jed pulled his hat down tight and followed his son's faithful companion. Into the heart of the storm reached its full fury as they descended toward Devil's Creek, turning the world into a chaos of driving rain and wind that howled through the canyon like the voices of the dead. Lightning strikes illuminated the landscape in stark, flickering moments that revealed the path ahead in sudden clarity before plunging everything back into grey darkness. Jed followed Ranger's confident lead, trusting the dog's knowledge of safe passage through terrain that had become treacherous with rushing water and loose stone. Devil's Creek itself was running high and fast, swollen with storm runoff that turned the normally gentle stream into a torrent capable of sweeping away anything in its path. The sound of rushing water mixed with thunder to create a symphony of natural violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains. Ranger led Jed upstream along the creek bank, moving with purpose despite the difficulty of the terrain. They found the big rock Thomas had mentioned in his letter, about 50 yards upstream from where they'd first reached the creek. It was a distinctive boulder, easily twice the height of a man, that had probably been deposited by some ancient glacier and left to mark this spot for countless centuries. The stone provided partial shelter from the storm, and Ranger immediately began digging at its base with the focused intensity of an animal that knew exactly what it was looking for. Jed joined the effort, using his hands and his knife to clear away decades of accumulated soil and debris. The ground here was softer than he'd expected, suggesting that someone had disturbed it relatively recently, in geological terms. As they dug deeper, Jed's fingers encountered something that definitely wasn't natural stone or root. Working together, man and dog uncovered a metal box roughly the size of a military ammunition case. It was sealed tight against moisture and marked with Thomas's initials carved deep into the metal surface. The weight of it suggested substantial contents, and Jed could hear papers rustling inside when he shifted the container in his hands. Finding shelter under the overhang of the big rock, Jed forced open the latches and lifted the lid. Inside, protected by multiple layers of oiled cloth, were documents that would change his understanding of his son's story one final time. The first item was a complete roster of Thomas's original military unit, with detailed notes written in his son's handwriting beside each name. Most of the entries were brief: killed at Brennan's Ridge, wounded, sent home, transferred to headquarters company. But several names were marked with longer annotations that told darker stories. Richardson, Marcus, ringleader in Linton Morrison killing. Violent drunk, tried to force me and Daniels to participate in robbery of civilian farms. When we refused, he threatened to turn us in as cowards unless we helped him kill more officers. McKenna Samuel, quartermaster who supplied us while we were hiding. Not helping out of kindness, was being blackmailed by Richardson over stolen supplies. Scared man in impossible situation, Henderson Carl went crazy after watching children get killed in village raid, started carrying enemy ears as trophies. Richardson encouraged this behavior. These weren't just notes about fellow soldiers. They were testimonies about war crimes, evidence of atrocities that Thomas had witnessed and refused to participate in. The picture that emerged was of a unit that had fallen apart morally, led by men who had lost any connection to the principles they were supposed to be fighting for. But it was the second group of documents that truly staggered Jed. These were copies of official military reports, somehow obtained and preserved by Thomas during his time as a deserter. Reports that detailed systematic cover-ups of civilian massacres, falsified casualty reports that hid the true cost of military incompetence, and orders that explicitly authorized the execution of American soldiers who refused to participate in what could only be called murder. The documents bore the signatures and seals of high-ranking officers, including some whose names Jed recognized from newspaper coverage of the war. These weren't the actions of rogue soldiers operating without authorization. This was policy, decided at the highest levels of military command and implemented by men who knew their orders violated every principle of military honor. At the bottom of the box, wrapped separately in silk that had probably come from his mother's sewing basket, was Thomas's most precious possession, a simple stone cairn made from 5 carefully selected rocks, each one representing one of the executed deserters. Thomas had built this memorial during his final days, creating a monument to honor the memory of men who had died for choosing conscience over orders. Jed lifted the cairn out of the box with trembling hands, feeling the weight of each stone and understanding the love that had gone into its construction. This wasn't just a memorial. It was Thomas's way of ensuring that his companions would be remembered properly, regardless of what lies the military chose to tell about their deaths. Ranger watched as Jed examined each component of Thomas's final legacy. The dog's brown eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond animal intelligence. For 20 years, this faithful companion had guarded not just the location of Thomas's grave, but the evidence that would vindicate the choice Thomas and his friends had made when they walked away from a war that had forgotten the difference between honor and murder. The storm was beginning to subside, lightning moving off toward distant peaks and rain settling into the steady rhythm that meant the worst had passed. But Jed remained kneeling beside Devil's Creek, holding his son's stone memorial and feeling the full weight of 20 years of grief finally beginning to transform into something that might eventually become peace. The graves were exactly where Thomas had said they would be, on a small rise overlooking Devil's Creek where the morning sun would touch them first each day. 5 simple mounds of carefully arranged stones, weathered by 20 years of mountain seasons, but still clearly marking the final resting place of young men who had died for principles their own country refused to acknowledge. Ranger led Jed to the grave on the far left, slightly separated from the others, and sat down beside it with the patient dignity of a faithful guardian completing a long vigil. This was Thomas's grave, and the dog's demeanor left no doubt that this was the destination they'd been traveling toward. Since that first evening when the wounded animal had appeared at Jed's cabin, Jed knelt beside his son's grave and placed Thomas's stone cairn at the head of the burial mound where it belonged. The 5 rocks fit perfectly against the larger stones that marked the gravesite, as if Thomas had planned this final arrangement during his last days alive. It was a father's memorial, placed on his son's grave by the son himself, a gesture of love that transcended death and time. The simple act of placing the cairn unleashed 20 years of grief that Jed had never properly processed. It grieved for a son who died heroically in battle, mourned a loss that made sense within the framework of patriotic sacrifice. But now he was grieving for a boy who had been murdered by his own army for refusing to compromise his moral principles. And the weight of that different loss was almost unbearable. He spoke aloud to Thomas for the first time since receiving that telegram 2 decades ago, words that poured out of him like water from a broken dam. He told his son about the 20 years of loneliness, about the cabin he'd built as a monument to loss, about the way he'd tried to honor Thomas's memory by living the kind of principled life his boy would have respected. He spoke about the journal, about following Ranger through the mountains, about discovering the truth that the military had worked so hard to hide. He told Thomas about finding the letters, the photographs, the evidence of war crimes that had driven a young man to choose desertion over participation in atrocities. Most importantly, he told Thomas that he understood, that he was proud of the choice his son had made, proud of the moral courage that had cost Thomas his life but preserved his honor, that he would rather have a son who died standing up for what was right than one who lived by compromising his principles. Ranger listened to every word, occasionally moving closer to offer the kind of silent comfort that animals provide better than most humans. When Jed's words finally ran out, leaving him empty but somehow lighter, the dog moved to his side and pressed against his leg with gentle insistence. It was then that Jed noticed what Ranger had been guarding all these years. Around the dog's neck, nearly hidden by his thick fur, was an old military collar tag that Jed had somehow missed during their days together. He reached out carefully and turned the tag so he could read the inscription. Ranger, 47th Infantry Regiment, property of PVT, Thomas Cole. This wasn't just any dog that had wandered into Thomas's final camp. This was his son's own companion, an animal that had served alongside Thomas in the military and had somehow escaped the execution that claimed his master. Ranger had spent 20 years guarding Thomas's grave and waiting for the right moment to lead someone to the truth. The implications of that discovery hit Jed like a physical blow. Ranger had been with Thomas during the war, had witnessed the atrocities that drove his master to desert, had probably been present during those final terrible days when the military hunters closed in. This dog was the only living witness to what had really happened in these mountains 20 years ago. Understanding flooded through Jed as pieces of the story finally clicked into place. Ranger hadn't led him to Thomas's journal by chance. He'd been making deliberate choices, revealing the truth in carefully planned stages. The dog had known exactly which caches to visit, which documents to help uncover, which path would lead to the complete story of what had happened to Thomas and his companions. Jed reached out and gently removed the military collar, reading the serial number and unit designation that confirmed everything he'd suspected. Then he placed his hand on Ranger's grizzled head and made a promise that echoed across the mountain valley. "You've been faithful longer than any creature should have to be," he said quietly. "You've kept your promise to Thomas, and now it's time for you to rest. You're coming home with me, old friend. You've earned a warm fire and regular meals, and a place where you don't have to guard secrets anymore." Ranger's tail wagged once, a simple acknowledgement that his long mission was finally complete. The dog who had spent 2 decades protecting the truth about Thomas Cole could finally lay down the burden of guardianship and accept the comfort of belonging to someone who understood the depth of his devotion. As the afternoon sun broke through the dissipating storm clouds, Jed stood beside his son's grave and felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. The possibility of healing. The truth was finally known, and with that knowledge came the power to decide how Thomas's story should be told to a world that had forgotten the difference between patriotism and blind obedience. The journey back to Jed's cabin took 3 days, not because of the distance, but because both man and dog needed time to process what they'd discovered in the high country. They moved slowly through familiar terrain, stopping frequently to rest and to let the weight of 20 years of revealed truth settle into something they could both carry without breaking. Under its burden, Ranger had changed during their time at Thomas's grave. The urgent purposefulness that had driven him for 2 decades had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like relief. He no longer ranged ahead on the trail, scanning for threats or destinations only he could see. Instead, he stayed close to Jed's side, walking with the measured pace of an old dog who had finally found his way home. The cabin felt different when they reached it on the 3rd evening. The same walls, the same furniture, the same stone chimney, sending up its familiar ribbon of smoke. But somehow the space had been transformed from a monument to loss into something that might eventually become a home again. Ranger explored the single room with careful interest, then settled on the rug near the wood stove with a contentment that suggested he understood this was where he belonged now. Jed spent the first week back simply living with the truth he'd discovered. He read through Thomas's journal again, this time understanding the full context of his son's words. He organized the documents he'd collected into careful categories: evidence of war crimes, proof of military cover-ups, testimony about the real reasons behind Thomas's desertion and execution. The most difficult decision was what to do with Robert. Daniels's final letter to his sister in Ohio. After several days of consideration, Jed composed his own letter to accompany it, explaining how he'd come to possess documents that revealed the truth about her brother's death. He mailed both letters to the address Thomas had noted in his journal, not knowing if she was still alive or if the letter would reach her, but feeling obligated to try. 3 weeks later, he received a response that brought tears to his eyes. Margaret Daniels was indeed still alive, now a widow with grown children of her own, and she had spent 40 years wondering what had really happened to her brother. She thanked Jed for giving her the truth she'd never stopped hoping to find, and she asked if she could visit Robert's grave someday when her health permitted the journey. That correspondence led to others. Using information from Thomas's detailed roster of his military unit, Jed began reaching out to other families who had received similar telegrams about sons who died heroically in battle. Most of his letters went unanswered, but a few responses trickled back from people who had always suspected there was more to their loved one's story than the military had been willing to share. Slowly, carefully, Jed began to document not just Thomas's story, but the broader pattern of cover-ups and lies that had hidden the truth about what happened to young men who refused to compromise their principles in an increasingly senseless war. He started a new journal, this one meant for the living rather than the dead, recording names and dates and details that might someday help other families understand what had really happened to their sons. Ranger proved to be excellent company during these long writing sessions. The old dog seemed to understand the importance of the work Jed was doing, lying quietly nearby while pages filled with careful documentation of truths that had been buried for too long. Sometimes Jed would read passages aloud, and Ranger would lift his head as if listening, as if he too needed to hear Thomas's story told properly at last. Winter came early that year, bringing heavy snows that isolated the cabin for weeks at a time. But the solitude felt different now. Not the desperate loneliness of a man hiding from life, but the productive quiet of someone engaged in meaningful work. Jed found himself looking forward to each day's writing, to the gradual construction of a narrative that honored not just Thomas, but all the young men who had died for choosing conscience over convenience. Spring brought visitors. Margaret Daniels made the journey from Ohio, accompanied by her grown son, to visit her brother's grave and to see the mountains where he'd spent his final months. She was a small, dignified woman in her 70s, with the same serious eyes Jed remembered from the photograph in Daniels's belongings. She knelt beside her brother's grave and spoke to him quietly for a long time, while Jed and Ranger waited respectfully nearby. Other families followed, parents, siblings, children who had grown up with questions about fathers and uncles whose deaths had never quite made sense. Jed welcomed them all, sharing what he knew about their loved ones' final months and helping them understand the moral courage that had led to such tragic endings. The small meadow near Devil's Creek became an unofficial memorial site, tended by people who finally understood what their family members had died defending. Someone placed a wooden cross there, carved with the names of all 5 executed deserters. Others left flowers, letters, small tokens of remembrance that transformed the lonely graves into a place of honor rather than shame. Jed never tried to publicize the broader story or seek justice against the military officials who had orchestrated the cover-ups. Most of them were long dead anyway, and he'd learned that some truths are more powerful when they're shared quietly between people who need to hear them rather than shouted from platforms where they might become political ammunition. But he did continue writing, documenting not just the facts of what had happened, but the deeper questions about duty and conscience that his son's story raised. He wrote about the courage required to walk away from authority when authority demanded the abandonment of human decency. He wrote about the kind of patriotism that honored country by refusing to let it commit atrocities in the name of national interest. On quiet evenings, with Ranger sleeping by the fire and mountain wind whispering through the pines outside, Jed would read aloud from Thomas's original journal. The words no longer brought the sharp pain of fresh grief, but something closer to the bittersweet satisfaction of finally understanding a story that had taken 20 years to tell. Completely, some wounds never heal, but they can be transformed into something that honors rather than torments the living. Thomas Cole had died defending principles that transcended nationality and military authority, and his father had finally learned to be proud of that choice rather than simply grieved by its consequences. In the mountains of Montana, where silence and solitude allow important truths to surface slowly, an old man and an older dog had found their way home at last.